Good evening. My name's Aidan Byrne. I'm the Provost here at the University of Queensland. Welcome this evening to an event as part of UQ's Global Leadership Program. This is a program where we have thought-provoking discussions with UQ's alumni. I'd like to begin though by acknowledging the traditional owners and the custodianship of the land that we meet today. And it's really lands that we meet today because we're spread far and wide. But I would like to pay our respects to their ancestors and descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to our country, and we recognise their valuable contributions to Australia and global society. This is an event that's going to talk about a connection across the Tasman to New Zealanders. So kia ora koutou for New Zealanders. Delight to have you here too. I'm a reverse alumnus. I grew up in New Zealand and came to Australia and was stuck. And I do fortunately manage to go backwards and forwards between New Zealand quite a lot. I'm in awe, I have to say, on what's happening in New Zealand culturally, and always in awe of what's happening in New Zealand in terms of its landscape is distinct and different from Australia. But of course, Australia too, you come to appreciate as a very diverse place. With different things. So when we come into a conversation which looks at can we actually, in this environment where international travel has been quite challenged, can we open this up? Can we actually appreciate each other's countries more? I really do think that's something that could be very special and very positive, and we're going to explore those ideas today. With us today, hosting this is Gabby Walters. And she has a substantial background in tourism and with an emphasis on consumer psychology. So it's a delight to have you here, Gabby. We will give you further instructions on how to do this and look forward to hearing the conversation. So maybe I'll hand over to you, Gabby, to do the further introductions and some housekeeping.
Thank you very much, Professor Byrne, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Before we get started, just some housekeeping. So your videos and microphones have been automatically disabled, and that's not because we don't want to hear from you, but you're more than welcome to submit questions. Please use the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and we encourage any questions at any time throughout the presentation. We'll have plenty of time once this session comes to the end to answer as many questions as we can. So I'm very excited to discuss this topic today that focuses on the trans-Tasman bubble. I'm sure you will all agree with me that anything related to COVID-19 is just so unpredictable, and with recent events in Victoria and New South Wales, the tourism industry is once again taking a hit. Personally, I believe that this bubble brings hope to our industry and a touch of normality for those of us who are really missing that international travel adventures. Ladies and gentlemen, today I'm extremely lucky to be joined by two leading tourism experts who between them have a lot of knowledge on how this trans-Tasman bubble can work. Our guests not only represent both sides of the ditch, but also represent the views from an academic and an industry perspective. Representing New Zealand, and I should remind you, it's not a competition or a rugby match, I'm welcoming Professor James Home. James is a professor at the University of Otago in New Zealand. He's a visiting professor of sustainable tourism at the University of Stavanger in Norway, and one of our very own Jim White Fellows with the University of Queensland's tourism discipline. James is co-editor of the Journal of Sustainable Tourism, and his research interests generally address tourism, sustainable development and environmental change, as well as the interplay of sport and tourism. Thank you so much for joining us today, James. Representing Queensland, Australia, welcome also to Michael Branner from Tourism and Events Queensland. Michael is one of Australia's top advertising, media and marketing leaders, and he has over 25 years experience. Prior to his position with Tourism and Events Queensland, Michael was the head of brand planning and digital at Suncorp. He's also held senior roles in Australian media, notably as Group Marketing Director for Nine Entertainment. Now, I'm not sure if many of you recall this campaign, but I certainly do. Michael led the team responsible for the creation of the Best Job in the World campaign for Tourism Queensland. What an accolade and a great initiative. Michael, thank you for being here today.
Pleasure.
Okay, so first and foremost, I'm going to direct this question to you both. Michael, let's hear from you first. Why does a trans-Tasman bubble make sense? And how will tourism in Australia and New Zealand benefit from this initiative?
Thank you, Gabby. A great way to start the webinar with a question like that. The trans-Tasman bubble makes sense for lots of different reasons, but primarily I look at it from 2 points of view. First of all, from the economic benefit that a trans-Tasman bubble could unlock and realise, and also secondly from a consumer point of view as well, and the traveller point of view, in terms of releasing the opportunity for people to get out there and start exploring and start travelling and experiencing the world. And that happens on both sides, you know, not just from an Australian or a Queensland point of view, but from a New Zealand point of view as well. But if you think about, first and foremost, if, you know, selfishly looking at Queensland, the economic opportunity that can be reopened by a bubble. You know, Queensland receives around $600 million per year in overnight visitor expenditure out of New Zealand, and that has been turned off. That tap has literally stopped in recent months, and that has had an incredibly dramatic impact on our tourism industry, not just from New Zealand, but also other parts of the world as well, and domestically too. But the opportunity to turn that tap back on is sitting there waiting to happen if a trans-Tasman bubble was to eventuate. New Zealand has for a long time been the #1 contributor to Queensland in terms of economic impact from international visitation. Recently overtaken by China, which is obviously of no surprise to many. But for so long, New Zealand has contributed significantly to the economic value of tourism in Queensland, and has really played a key role in the development and growth of Queensland's tourism industry through that visitation. You know, we receive close to 500,000 Kiwi visitors into Queensland each year, which is a big number. And it's not just about those guys coming each year. What we know is that something like 74% of New Zealanders have visited Queensland more than 4 times. So yeah, you know, it's a tremendous opportunity and a huge opportunity to turn that tap back on. And at a point in time when our industry is really, you know, starving and needing a kickstart, opening up a bubble with New Zealand could be just the kickstart that we need. And if I think about it from a traveller's point of view, going both ways, when it comes to kickstarting the economy and getting people moving again, New Zealand is a destination of choice for many Australians, and they're keen to go there. And we know that from a Queensland point of view or an Australian point of view, it works the same way as well. You know, that so many New Zealanders, you know, see Australia as a place that they want to visit, and therefore get out there and experience it. I think we're seeing there's so much pent up demand there. People are ready to travel again. They're looking to travel again. If the planets and stars can align and people can get traveling again, then, you know, that relationship between Queensland, Australia and New Zealand is there waiting, and therefore we should look to the opportunity if it's there.
Absolutely. And James, what's your perspective on this?
My perspective is very reflective of what we've just heard. From a Kiwi point of view, from this side of the ditch, obviously we all know that tourism is hugely important to our economy. We're just facing this unprecedented set of circumstances. Who would have imagined at the start of this year that our international borders would be closed? The tourism industry in this country is significant, obviously, to our economy. It's a huge source of employment for Kiwis. The industry's been crippled by COVID, and you know, very, very soon after the border closures, and obviously our government was pretty quick to respond to the COVID crisis. Jacinda Ardern talked about going hard and going early, and really tackling community transmission head on. But very soon the conversation extended to what the future might hold for our tourism industry, with huge uncertainty around employment. A massive concern for all of us. And the trans-Tasman bubble entered the conversation very, very early. The reality is, as we've heard, that you know, most of our trade and most of our tourism comes from the source markets closest to us, and the only source market close to New Zealand is Australia. All of our other markets are extremely distant and long haul. And reflecting that, Australia is enormously important to us for our inbound tourism. I hasten to add that well over half of our total tourism is domestic. So we have fallen back immediately on our domestic markets. We've just finished 2 weeks of school holidays, and many of our tourism businesses in this country have reported upward of 9% growth on the same period last year, based entirely on all of our domestic market being captured within the border. So, there are some positive signs, but the reality is that post-school holidays, now the challenge really kicks in, and there's a lot of political pressure to actively explore the possibilities around a trans-Tasman bubble.
And James, I happen to know you, and I know your research, and I know that you think that this is going to be a really good thing for the planet. Can you elaborate a little on that?
Yeah, so I've written a little bit recently of the changing circumstances, and what I've argued is that domestic tourism is very good for our economy, but it's also good in terms of the amount of CO2 that we produce per dollar of tourism GDP, because obviously domestic tourists don't have to fly to get here. The other reality is that visitors from Australia have a relatively low carbon footprint per dollar GDP compared to our European and other long-haul markets. So I just mentioned a study that was published some years ago now, 2010. That study looked at our inbound visitor markets and CO2 and found that Australian tourists made up in that year, 2010, 37% of all of our international visitors, and they were responsible for 13% of air travel emissions. By contrast, visitors from Europe made up 18% of total visitors, but 43% of CO2. So the argument is that if we focus more on our proximal markets, mainly domestic tourism and Australian tourism, then the CO2 emissions per dollar GDP will come down very, very significantly. So the idea of these bubbles, whether it's a Pacific bubble or trans-Tasman bubble, may actually be an insight into a more sustainable future where we market less to the extreme long-haul markets and more to Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, Pacific neighbours that are actually already our really important international markets.
It certainly makes a lot of sense. And there's a lot of talk among tourism academics around how can we come back better. This is our opportunity to stop and think about tourism and reflect on where we're at with tourism and issues such as over tourism and CO2 emissions that the industry emits. So some great insight there, James. And if anybody wants to read further about that particular research, we'll share the link with you in the email to come out after the session today. When we look at the new risks people are having to navigate now when it comes to travel, from my perspective, New Zealand and Australia are likely to be considered low-risk destinations, particularly to those who tend to be more risk-averse. So, yeah, it's no doubt a great initiative. So moving on, there are certainly a lot of benefits, as we've just discussed, but we are getting a few curveballs in very recent times, which have led to some delays in discussions about the trans-Tasman bubble, which brings us to the challenges of this arrangement. Michael, what do you see as the main challenges of this initiative for Australia, and we'll let you talk about Queensland in particular as well?
Sure. The first and primary challenge is getting it to actually happen. There's a lot of talk. There's been no doubt that there has been much talk and certainly publicised talk through media about the trans-Tasman bubble eventuating. The reality at this point in time is that there's been no decision to do so, and therefore we all sit hypothesising and planning just exactly what we need to do should a bubble eventuate. But until such a point in time, and if I look at it from an Australian perspective, a federal decision is made. It has to be made at the federal level. The states are, locked out of and unable to go it alone without that federal backing. Until that federal backing is made and the federal decision is given to open up the bubble, we sit on our hands and we wait. And that's the reality of the situation we're in. Once that decision is made, then there's a lot that needs to happen. There's so much and so many things that need to fall into place to begin actually taking advantage of the bubble. First and foremost, the aviation capacity needs to be stood back up. Without aviation, without the flights, without those flights being loaded into systems and airlines agreeing to put the flights back on, the bubble is still a hypothetical bubble, because people need to be able to get both ways across the Tasman to be able to leverage the benefits. Behind all of that, then the rest of the infrastructure needs to take place as well. The trade partners, the agency groups, travel agent groups, the wholesalers, everybody who is a connected part of that value chain that actually makes tourism happen, then needs to, in many cases, stand themselves back up to be able to support the demand that may well come into place there. And finally, consumers need to have the confidence to actually start to travel internationally again as well. There needs to be that level of certainty from a consumer point of view around traveling safely. What is that going to look like? And how do both destinations, both Australia and New Zealand, ensure that we give the traveller the confidence to know that travel is safe between the two destinations? It's fantastic that I think both are seen at the moment as being relatively safe places. We've both done a really good job of containing and flattening the curve, as they say, through this period that, I think the reputation of New Zealand and Australia stands, head and shoulders above many other parts of the world. So, that's a good thing. We've got that going for us. But first and foremost, selfishly from an Australian point of view, we need the governments to agree that the bubble will proceed. And if that happens, then we will run at 1,000 miles an hour to do everything else behind that to put it into place.
Make it happen. James, what about you? What do you think the challenges are from a New Zealand perspective?
Yeah, so again, Michael has summed up the situation very nicely from a tourism perspective. I think from this side of the ditch, the clear signals are that our border is sealed until we are absolutely assured that we don't put the current status of the virus in New Zealand at any risk. So at the moment, we have zero community transmission, but we have Kiwis, expats coming back from countries that are really stricken by COVID. And obviously there are all sorts of measures that are now in place. Took a little bit of time, I'd have to say, and there were real concerns here about the security of the border. But now any visitors coming across the border have to stand out 14 days of quarantine, hotel quarantine. The government has met those costs to date. There are big debates around whether they'll continue to meet those costs, and that there'll be some cost sharing or perhaps transfer of all of those costs to the returning Kiwis. About $3,000, perhaps a little bit more, to be quarantined in a hotel for 14 days. So the real challenge is to look to establish bubbles that do not compromise our public health status vis-a-vis COVID-19. With that in mind, much of the talk originally was around trans-Tasman, but the Pacific bubble linking to Pacific Islands, also heavily tourism dependent, and without COVID, the Pacific bubble now seems a closer likelihood, a greater likelihood than the trans-Tasman. Obviously, we've been watching Australia's circumstance, particularly Victoria, in recent weeks with a great amount of concern. And the trans-Tasman bubble has moved, I think, in many people's minds more towards state-based air bridges. For example, with Queensland, which is obviously doing much better. And a lot of Kiwis, as Michael has said, love travelling to Queensland, have an appetite for visiting Queensland. But we've also heard, of course, that this will be an Australian federal decision and not a state-based decision. So there are these enormous challenges facing the trans-Tasman bubble with the situation, particularly in Victoria presently. So those are some of the issues that that we're grappling with. The government is really keen, and we've got a general election on the 19th of September, and there's a lot of pressure on the government to aggressively advance discussions of tourism bubbles. But our current government is adamant that we're not going to put at risk the work that's been done by the so-called team of 5 million. You know, there's been a huge groundswell in New Zealand, and at the top of our list of priorities is to safeguard the work that we put in collectively in March, April, May to suppress COVID. The only other thing I'd like to say is that, and Michael's alluded to this, we are moving towards a multi-tiered global system. We see in Europe borders being reopened and tourism flows being encouraged by the WTO, for example, between countries where COVID is not controlled. I think the situation, certainly the perspective here in New Zealand, is that we need to be in that top tier of safe tourism destinations, and any bubbles will need to be in place that won't compromise that. In that respect, we're looking at markets, for example, like the student study market, which is 23% of international visitor expenditures in this country, as in 2019. And so attracting students, for example, to help to restart that visitor economy is something that we're looking at, because, of course, students can quarantine for 2 weeks and then get into study in classrooms with supervisors face-to-face, whereas that's not assured in many parts of the world.
So it seems evident there's a lot of ducks that we have to line up. We have to get the aviation sector behind this. In Australia, we have to get the federal government behind this. And ideally, we'd love to have a little bubble between Queensland and New Zealand, but that doesn't seem to be a reality, Michael, does it?
Look, I think, Gabby, the other thing that, a Queensland-New Zealand bubble doesn't feel like it's going to be a reality without an Australia-New Zealand bubble. That's clearly the communication that's been delivered at the federal level. And as much as we would love to suggest that there was the opportunity to strike out on one's own, that isn't going to be the case. It is a federal thing. And the other thing I think we need to be conscious of as well, and we're seeing it, and James has alluded to it as well, is the consumer sentiment piece is really important. The last thing we want to do is go backwards. And the last thing you want to do is set up situations where we open up and next thing you know, we're closing up again. So getting to that point where there is confidence to open a bubble is really one of the last major hurdle that we'll need to jump over. We see that there's enormous sentiment for opening up bubbles within the tourism sector and within the tourism industry. We also see at a broader population level that there is a lot of sentiment that suggests that we need to stay closed as long as possible. So it's, it's a real push and pull thing. It's a real tussle. We absolutely get, and we know that there is huge demand within the industry sector to open up, and for all the right reasons as well. But we also understand at a broader consumer level that, what they're seeing things like Victoria, they're seeing what's going on in Victoria. They're well aware of, what could happen should there be an escalation of the COVID situation. And therefore, there's hesitation to suggest that opening the borders in their eyes is the right thing to be doing as well. So there are so many different things that all need to line up to make this possible. All we've got to do is make sure that we have all our ducks in a row for when the time is right to do so. Yeah.
And I can imagine that planning at the current time, it's difficult with things changing so rapidly, but 100%, like through my research in tourist psychology or consumer psychology, it doesn't matter what you have in place. If consumers aren't feeling confident to travel, then you're wasting your time. So consumers, tourists really need to feel that the industry has their best interests at heart.
And the sentiment of the destination needs to be there to welcome tourists in as well.
That's right. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. just moving on, I want to talk about this term we use in tourism. Well, this is relevant to the next question. So there's a great word we use in tourism that's co-opetition. And co-opetition is like when all operators within a destination need to work together to promote that destination in its entirety, to get people there. But then once this happens, they become competitors. So they're all in competition with each other to win their business. I see an element of this in relation to this trans-Tasman bubble arrangement. Australia, for example, needs a collaborative effort because the federal government won't let us just promote Queensland, from all states and territories to promote Australia to New Zealand. But Michael, how does Queensland stand out to be a destination of choice? So how do we win?
Yeah. We're fortunate in some respects that Queensland is a very well known destination in the eyes of New Zealand and Kiwi travellers. You know, the Kiwis do love Queensland. They love Queensland for what Queensland is famous for, which is our amazing weather, our sunshine, our beaches, our great al fresco outdoor dining scene, all those type of things. You know, the warm tropical climate. You know, we are well renowned and loved for that from a New Zealand point of view, and the repeat visitation numbers speak to that, which is absolutely fantastic. So as a destination of choice, we know that amongst Kiwis, we are, you know, the #1 destination of choice for a leisure traveller. You know, we also get lots of VFR, so, you know, visiting friends and relatives travel as well. But if you look at the leisure and holiday sector, you know, we have around 42% share of the leisure market into Australia in Queensland. So the dominant destination, which is a fantastic position to be in, but it's also one to protect at the same point in time as well, because we know that consumer trends change and, you know, travellers' needs change, and you know, as we come out of this COVID situation, you know, will consumers want to do the same things they did before? So therefore, remaining the destination of choice is going to be a matter of ensuring that we position the destination in the eyes of what the traveller is going to be looking for post-COVID as well. So ensuring that, you know, things like a sense of freedom, a sense of space, all those things that the research is telling us consumers are becoming more and more sympathetic with and in need of post-COVID are going to be really key ways to look to market the destination. You know, it's not necessarily going to be about going to places where you feel like you are, you know, caught up in a crowd or not having a sense of space around you. So we're certainly looking to our marketing activity, our marketing materials, to ensure that when we look at images, when we look at video content, whatever, that those cues are there within our marketing materials. So as people feel like we will be a safe destination, people will be inspired to visit here because it meets their needs post-COVID as well. Their need to get away, their need to you know, go and explore places where they feel they could be the only person there. All those type of things are cues that will be really important moving forward. And hopefully by being consumer-centric, by being responsive to what we see our consumer needs, we can maintain that destination of choice position in the eyes of Kiwi travellers when they're looking at Australia as their options moving forward. We will never compete with Sydney for the experiences that Sydney has to offer, and we get that and we know that. We may never be positioned, you know, in the same way with Melbourne again, or Victoria in some of their experiences, but we know we have amazing experiences here in Queensland that Kiwis are attracted to, and we know we can also compete really strongly against their needs post-COVID in terms of the type of experiences they'll be looking for as well. So, you know, that's probably all our trade secrets given away in in a couple of minutes, but
no one will tell anyone.
No one will tell anyone. I get it. So, yeah, that's our aim.
Yep. Okay, James, can you see the same issue for New Zealand? Like, are there going to be winners and losers within New Zealand? Are there destinations that are likely to be more popular than others, or how are they going to ensure that everyone gets a fair piece of the pie, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a great question, Gabby, and it's an enormous challenge. Michael's already told us about the challenges of restarting such a complex industry from a blank start, from zero. Once we get the wheels turning again, there are going to be some really significant further challenges for us to consider. I think that COVID-19 has brought Australia and New Zealand closer together. At the moment, within our borders in New Zealand, we have this really strong sense of doing the right thing for our tourism businesses in this country. And obviously the focus is on domestic. That's 23 out of $40 billion a year in tourism expenditure, domestic tourists. But there's this real willingness, I think, to work closely with Australia to make this trans-Tasman bubble a world first safe air corridor between our destinations. So I think we've come a lot closer together. And I think that any concerns about winners and losers maybe a bridge that we can cross when we get to it, so to speak. In 2019, Australians spent $2.5 billion in the New Zealand economy, and New Zealanders spent 1.7 billion, I think, of the total 5 billion spent overseas in 2019. So Australia and Queensland, as Michael has said, is really important as a destination for Kiwis. We love travelling to Queensland. Yes, we love going to Sydney and Melbourne as well, but there is something really special about Queensland. It's very attractive to us. We're in the middle of winter here right now, and there's lots of talk about reopening Rarotonga, for example, and reopening Queensland would be extremely attractive for Kiwis. One of the other challenges we'll face, and we're facing it, we're beginning to face this now, we have completely ignored our domestic tourism market as far as marketing is concerned historically. Our 100% pure marketing campaign has been global, and it's targeted international visitors. Now we're facing a problem of rediverting our marketing efforts to domestic tourists, and subsequently, we expect, to Australian states. And how we do that in a way that is equitable and fair, you know, everyone knows about Queenstown, but coastal Otago, Dunedin, other parts of central Otago, other parts of New Zealand want to see the same sorts of opportunities for tourism to restart their economies. So how we market to the domestic market in a way that's equitable regionally within New Zealand, and how we do the same when the trans-Tasman bubble opens, those are really challenging questions, and those are challenges that we're going to have to face up to pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, just going back to Michael's point around coastal and regional destinations being favoured, and my research on COVID has certainly confirmed that people are wanting to sort of gravitate away from cities and more crowded areas, and they will embrace coastal and regional destinations, which I think could be a real opportunity for both Australia and New Zealand in dispersing tourists towards those destinations that generally, as a rule, don't get the visitation that our major tourism hubs do. So some great insight there. And Michael, Queensland offers all of that. I mean, why would you go anywhere else, really?
Oh, that's so true, Gabby. And I think you're right, but I think that's also the opportunity with New Zealand as well, is and our research backs it up, is that Queensland is well known amongst New Zealand. Certain parts of Queensland probably more so than others. You know, we're certainly recognised for our Gold Coast, we're recognised for our Sunshine Coast, Brisbane, and potentially to some degree, you know, North Queensland, driven more so now by the aviation access in. So, you know, the airport access has traditionally been to the Gold Coast, Brisbane, Sunshine Coast and Cairns. There is so much more of a Queensland that is unknown amongst Kiwi travellers as well, and there's a big opportunity there to really show them a Queensland that they potentially have never seen before and didn't know about before now. And again, giving away the war chest, that's also becomes part of the strategy as well, is, you know, the Queensland, you know, there's so much more to the Queensland you already know. So, you know, if you're thinking about, you know, getting over here and exploring Queensland, don't just come to the Gold Coast. You know, Gold Coast is amazing. Yes, definitely come back there, but go and see a bit more of Queensland while you're here as well.
Yeah, there's some beautiful coastlines to discover.
Yep.
And speaking of coastal destinations and that 3S sun, sand and surf appeal, there's talk about, and it was mentioned earlier, the Pacific Island nations being included in this travel bubble and becoming a Pacific bubble. Many of them are COVID-free, as we know, and many of them have a high economic dependency on tourism. So why not? And Michael, what do you see as the implications for Australia in including these islands? Vanuatu, Fiji, do we need to be competing with these?
Well, that potentially creates part of the challenge, doesn't it? Is that those islands are lined up against Queensland in terms of their product offering, particularly around that island beach type vacation, the fly and flop, sit in the sun, and taking a bit of culture is definitely something that they compete with us on. So it could be a negative. But at the same point in time, I can absolutely see the attractiveness to it from an Australian point of view.
Mm-hmm.
There is definitely an outbound Australian market that would find the Cook Islands, Fiji, other Pacific Islands incredibly attractive destinations to go to, whilst they can't explore other parts of the world. So put your consumer hat on, think about it from a consumer point of view. Given everything that we've been through, ensuring that consumers have choice and options about where to travel is a great thing. It only encourages them to spend more and support the industry, to the best they possibly can during a recovery phase.
Yeah. What about the balance between our outbound and inbound travel market?
Look, the Pacific Islands are definitely more of an outbound market from a Queensland or Australian point of view. We don't see a huge upside from an inbound point of view out of the Pacific Islands. New Zealand is where the opportunity for there really sits for us. So it doesn't offer a huge inbound opportunity. It is definitely one for Australians as far as outbound travel is concerned.
Yep. And James, how about New Zealand? How will New Zealand fare if these island nations come on board?
Yeah, good question, Gabby. I think I'd have to begin by saying that our current government has a strong sense of commitment to the Pacific Islands, has done so right from the start of its term in 2017, expressing concern around climate change and the possibilities of climate migrants and wanting to support those Pacific communities. That has certainly extended through this COVID crisis. So I think the government is very conscious of the importance of tourism to our Pacific neighbours' economies, and is keen to explore the Pacific Bubble proposal to support those economies. Of course, Kiwis love travelling to places like Rarotonga, Samoa, Tonga, and so I suppose that there are Kiwis who would also feel that they would benefit from an opening up of that Pacific Bubble. In terms of the costs and the benefits, the relative flows, of course, like Australia, this would be an outbound more than an inbound flow, although the Pacific Islands are quite important to our tourism economy in some ways. We see lots of VFR travel into Auckland in particular, the Upper North Island, with large Polynesian communities, so there would be benefits there for our economy, but primarily this would be a bubble that would be pursued to support those Pacific economies. Interestingly, I saw today a proposal being put forward by the Hamilton Council, floating the idea of Hamilton becoming a gateway for Pacific flights, and using Hamilton hotels for quarantine if necessary, to take pressure off Auckland Airport in terms of any other travellers coming in from international origins to Auckland. We could have a kind of Pacific cluster gateway, if you like, in Hamilton, looking again to perhaps play a part in restarting the tourism economy from a regional perspective. Yeah. So interesting to see these sorts of ideas being put forward. I don't know if Hamilton will serve as a gateway for Pacific flights, but certainly it's very much part of the conversation at the moment, how we might and when we might open up a Pacific bubble.
It's interesting to reflect on the opportunities of this particular crisis, yes, it has been very difficult for the tourism industry, but there are no doubt many opportunities that can be had, particularly when it comes to tourist dispersion and sustainability. So, we can look at this from a glass half full perspective, and I think with all the doom and gloom around, it's probably a good thing sometimes to reflect on those. I'm going to take us to our last question now, and this was this is leading on from that last question. So these island nations are COVID-free, and being COVID-free will hold a lot of weighting when it comes to destination preferences moving forward. But for that destination itself, being COVID-free and all, will the host communities really want to risk their own health status by encouraging visitors from other countries that still have active cases? What can and what will the tourism industry do to minimise the risk of transmission to and among tourists and host communities? Michael, are you able to share with us some of Queensland's COVID-safe plans that are likely to reassure our tourists and our communities?
Yeah, look, beyond the obvious one, obviously, is what's happening at a border control level. And, you know, both at a federal and a state level, there are, you know, many steps being put in place to ensure that people entering either the country or entering individual states and territories are either, you know, complying with any requirements around isolation and quarantining, and you know, that's been proven to be quite successful so far, and has ensured that if in the case of any outbreaks or the escalation of any outbreaks, that in many instances, you know, they are able to do contact tracing and identify, you know, and ensure that any potential outbreak is kept to a minimum. But if you step beyond that into the communities and into the individual operator environments, there are also many other things being done to ensure the traveller and also to ensure the community that things will remain safe. At a community level, one of the things that we've you know, had to really focus on within Queensland is the Indigenous communities and the need to ensure that, you know, the Indigenous communities remain safe and protected during this time. So you'll still find within Queensland at the moment that there are several parts of the state that you know, can't be entered from a tourism point of view because of the health concern to Indigenous communities, and that will get, you know, unlocked over time, and those communities will open up again, and as will the experiences within them. But you know, they're just some of the other steps that have been taken to be put in place there for both not only the protection of the community, but also for the travellers themselves. Within the broad industry, there's been a lot of work done through QTIC and through other industry bodies to ensure that our operators are adopting COVID-safe practices. And that's been an incredibly important step. So by putting a COVID-safe plan in place, and there are you know, within Queensland, there are around 3 that an operator can choose to follow and take the steps to ensure that they have a COVID-safe plan. They can then ensure and provide a level of reassurance to their guests and visitors that they are taking the right steps and right practices to ensure that the guests will feel like they are safe when they arrive, and that there are health and hygiene measures in place, social distancing in place, the right facilities such as the use of sanitizer and the availability of sanitizer, all those type of things, the correct amount of social distancing on a boat, a bus, a tour, attraction, all those things are at an event. So there's been a huge amount of work done at across government and cross industry level to ensure that the steps, the plans and the procedures are put in place to give the travellers a sense of safety and security when they visit here, but also importantly to let the operators know what they need to do at the other end as well, because it's a two-way street. It really is a two-way street. Everybody needs to play a part of the system. And then we've taken that a step further and brought that into our marketing communication activity as well. So we have a campaign concept in market that talks to the fact that Queensland is good to go. And we don't just mean good to go from the point of view of we're open. We also have taken that down a deeper layer to an industry level where an operator can talk about being good to go. And when an operator says they're good to go, it means that they are open. It means that they're ready to welcome guests, but it also means they have a COVID-safe plan in place. And that's, you know, that's really important. And we're seeing a lot of traction and a lot of you know, use of that messaging and a lot of use of that dialogue across the industry, and it's certainly, you know, providing everybody with a sense of understanding that Queensland is good to go in many ways, not just here, but also doing the right things from a COVID-safe point of view too.
I saw a billboard with that very message on it the other day, and I thought, what a great little slogan. And I think that is really important, and it's important for consumers to understand what that means, what good to go means. And yeah, very, very clever. James, how is New Zealand going to manage any sort of angst among the host communities around people coming in from other countries, and particularly Australia, where we still unfortunately cannot say that we don't have any active cases?
Yeah, this I think is the key to the trans-Tasman bubble. I think it's the biggest barrier that we face. Michael's talked about all the safeguards, sanitation, PPE, social distancing, etc. The situation here now is that we've been through the lockdown levels. We've been to lockdown level 4, and then we've come back down 3, 2 to 1. We've returned to normality. We have 0 community transmission. And the priority of the government and the medical officer of health is that we protect this status with everything at our disposal. So in the last 2 weeks, I have been sitting in a stadium with 30,000 people. I've been skiing, sitting on chairlifts with complete strangers, and often the conversations have been around, aren't we lucky? Isn't it amazing that we've got this normal life again? Obviously, we can't travel outside the borders, but we have graduation ceremonies coming up. We have sports events back to reasonably normal circumstances. So all else aside, with lockdown levels 1 through 4, we are going to protect our border. That's the policy of the current government. And that really is the context that we're facing at the moment. There is a huge amount of community concern about possible threats to our current 0 community transmission status. And that extends to Kiwis coming back into the country, being quarantined in hotels for 14 days. We've had 4 or so cases of people slipping out overnight and going to the local supermarket or whatever. And the government has said, these are not prisons. You know, we have secure hotels. We have police and armed forces securing those hotels, but they're not prisons. And there's been a huge resistance and really a public outcry against people who have breached their quarantine and put all of us at risk, put this effort of the team of 5 million at risk, put our economy at risk. So I think from a Kiwi point of view, it is all about the border, and we need to keep that border secure so that when tourism bubbles open, people can come here and circulate as normal, so to speak, without any stress or concern for the visitors themselves, but also for the host communities about COVID reinfection.
I think that's really important. As it's one thing to generate tourism activity and think of how to attract visitors, but we really need to ensure that our host communities are already willing to welcome visitors with open arms, because the last thing you want on a holiday is animosity, right? So it sounds like Australia and New Zealand have both got checks in place for this and doing a tremendous job. James and Michael, thank you so much for your fruitful and highly informative insight. Such a great discussion. We've learnt so much today, and I'm going to hand over to our audience members for some Q&A for the remainder of the session. We have a couple of questions that have come through. If you do have any questions, last minute questions, then please let us know. So just starting with our first question, the mutual benefits of the travel bubble are self-evident. Can we spend more time on the how and when it can start? So I think we don't have any definite dates, do we?
We don't.
We've talked about how it can start.
We talk about how, we don't know when.
Definitely, but we just don't know when. And unfortunately, if it was up to all of us sitting on this panel today, we could give you some certainty around that. We'd say next week. But yeah, so when it can start, that's obviously a decision that's up to the government, and when both destinations are ready and confident for this to be a success.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And there's been talk, I mean, there's huge uncertainty around vaccine. I saw yesterday, I think, news out of Oxford of human testing. now with some really promising signs around vaccine development. The how we've discussed, the when is just an enormous question mark because there are still so many unknown factors.
Yeah, and we've established that today, haven't we? Our second question, will the New Zealand election, haha, I was wondering if this would come up. It's a good question. Will the New Zealand election in September accelerate, decelerate the start of the trans-Tasman bubble? And if the answer is yes, what is the motivation, if any, for the Morrison government to accelerate opening? Bit of a political question here.
Yeah.
James, do you want to speak to the election in New Zealand first?
Yeah, this is going to be an enormous election issue, isn't it? I mean, we've already seen signs of different voices being expressed in Wellington. The Prime Minister's view is very clear, and we've spoken a little bit about that today. But even within her coalition, Winston Peters, the New Zealand First Party, has publicly stated that the trans-Tasman bubble must be accelerated, and that this is something that, well, originally, and this was some weeks ago, he said that this should have happened yesterday, quote unquote, to give a sense of the urgency that New Zealand First feels for this. The National Party, the opposition, have also stated that opening a trans-Tasman bubble is a huge priority for them to restart the economy. Obviously, Jacinda's position is that we need to safeguard our current status. So it is going to be a contentious issue in the election. And the answer to this question probably lies in the outcome of the election, which we can only speculate upon. I think there are going to be some significant shifts in the political landscape in New Zealand after this coming election. And we could discuss that at length. But really the makeup of the government in an MMP political system, it's very hard to predict what the makeup of the government will be after the election. But that will have a very, I think, a very important, it'll be an important factor that will determine whether the election result accelerates or decelerates the prospects of a trans-Tasman bubble.
Michael, do you have any comments or insight into what our government is thinking?
I would love to say I do. All I know is that both governments are talking regularly about this issue. You know, they are in frequent conversation and dialogue about the issue, and that is ongoing. And there will no doubt be a point in time, whether it's pre-election or post-election, when this conversation gets accelerated. And I think we'll all be really happy to see that happen when the conditions are right.
Yep, and we keep not getting distracted.
Gabby, can I come in here? One of the things
absolutely
that's going to be clear is that we have to get on top of what's happening in Victoria.
Yes.
Because I think for either government to open the borders, what one needs to do is to demonstrate that where one sees a spike, because they're going to happen, it can be got under control. So, you know, that's going to be a very clear measure before either government embarks on that route. You know, I couldn't resist not wanting to point out that UQ too is developing a vaccine. And, you know, I was talking to somebody yesterday not connected to doing the vaccine and reckons our vaccine is going to be more effective than the Oxford one. So I just thought I'd toss that one in there too, because
of course it is.
It's actually, no, seriously, it's a very extraordinary piece of work that these people have done, and we're really very, very optimistic on that one as well.
Can I chip in there as well? Otago's also in this game. But the comment I heard yesterday from Oxford was that we will probably need more than one vaccine, and that these efforts are all equally important, and that in terms of rollout and production, if we can develop 5 or 6 or 7 vaccines successfully, that will be much better than 1 or 2 or 3. One other quick point that I'd like to make here. The situation in Victoria is hugely significant to these discussions. And you might be interested to know that in New Zealand, in the last few days, the government has announced that if we have situations of second waves or community transmission, that they will look for regional lockdown, not national lockdown, and that the lockdown might even be limited to specific communities or suburbs to minimise the wider economic damage, which is very interesting in the context of what Michael has said about the need for a federal collective decision on opening up these air bridges, these bubbles. Certainly the New Zealand perspective is if we do have second waves, we will look to regional lockdowns, not national or provincial or statewide.
Has to be that way, otherwise we just won't continue.
Yeah.
So we have one final question from Peter Kine. Will travel insurance be a barrier now that COVID is a known event? So we haven't addressed the travel insurance issue. That's a whole new can of worms. But do either of you, James or Michael, have something to say about that?
I'm not an expert on travel insurance, but my assumption would be that the further you're going to go, the bigger the issue it will be. I think, you know, again, if you speak to a benefit of Australia and New Zealand, is our proximity, our short distances between borders. The minute you start to look to places further apart on the other side of the world, no doubt insurance becomes a much bigger issue. And I know obviously when you're looking to travel internationally and you're ticking the boxes and looking at the cost of your policy, all those type of things, you know, our nearest neighbours and certainly our most aligned neighbours in terms of New Zealand is one of those you know, more lower cost travel insurance options. So who knows? I think the further you go, the bigger the issue it will be.
I think you're right, and I think you know, the travel insurance companies will assess the risk, and the less risk associated with the travel, the better. So
that's right. You know, if the risk is zero between the two destinations, i.e., we get to a point where Australia and New Zealand are both you know, have, you know, managed to achieve suppression, then you would hope that insurance isn't an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And we need to also think about distance between medical systems as well, because there are some places, the US being a classic example, where it would just be insane to travel without health insurance. There's the question of insurance. There's also the question of availability of treatment. And we've seen in some of these parts of the world that hospital beds are just not available for COVID cases because of the pressures that have been put on those public health systems. So yes, it will be a factor. And it's probably actually, now I think about it, as we've seen destinations opening in Europe, places like Greece and Spain and Portugal reopening, I'd be interested to see what the travel insurance provisos are in that part of the world now. But it's going to be a factor. It takes me back to Michael's earlier comments about the complexities of restarting the tourism system. This is just one of countless questions that we're going to need to confront and tackle before we can reopen the safe tourism bubble.
Absolutely. Well, that brings us to the end of this event, unless James or Michael, you have any concluding comments?
No, an enjoyable time. Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this. We look forward to both people in New Zealand and Australia. Let's hope that we have this bubble, you know, in the foreseeable future. It will be a great thing for the tourism economy and industry.
Here. I'd just like to say thank you to Gabby and Aidan and everyone else involved in this webinar. This discussion has been absolutely fascinating from my point of view, and I just like Michael, I hope that Australia and New Zealand can work very closely together and successfully to create a world first, which will be a safe international travel zone for the tourism restart.
As do I, and thank you both, James and Michael, for joining us today. It was a pleasure to host you, and I'm sure our audience have enjoyed the session immensely. So that concludes the session today. Just some final notes. There'll be a little short survey for you to participate when you leave the session, and we'll be following up with a link to a recording of the webinar, and also an email with some further information as well. So thank you, everybody, and have a great night.
Thanks, Gabby.
Thanks, Gabby. Kia ora.
Kia ora.